Well, hi there. Welcome back to our Spark series on the virtues. And today we're just going to jump right in and we're talking about the virtue of fortitude. So, the definition of fortitude in the Catechism would read it's one of the four cardinal moral virtues which ensures firmness in difficulties and constancy in doing the good. And that's a lot of technical jargon. Mostly the way I think about fortitude as a virtue is that it's where courage and strength mix. And sometimes I also like to consider that toughness. I think of strength as like the ability to like carry something heavy, to bear a load. And I think of like toughness as being able to carry that heavy load over and over and over again, which is kind of where that courage portion comes in. So I think of fortitude as that virtue, as that, again, that mixture of courage and strength, which again, sometimes can be at least in my mind, it kind of translates into toughness. Now, where this kind of works itself into kind of the whole framework for our series, right? Again, we're looking at that passage from First Corinthians. So in that passage from First Corinthians, it's really in verse 7 that St. Paul starts talking about fortitude, right? Because First Corinthians 13:7 says, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, and endures all things. And so again, not really one of those encapsulates all of what we mean by fortitude, but when you think about all of that in tandem, that's where again that mixture of strength and that courage they kind of come together in that one virtue which we call fortitude. Jesus demonstrates this all the time, which is, I think, one of my favorite parts about reading through the Gospels is that you get to see Jesus demonstrating and really living out. He lives out the virtues in a way that makes it accessible to us, right? Because sometimes it can seem hard to relate to Jesus, knowing that he is the second person of the Trinity and is God, and it can seem like, well, of course he can live out the virtues, but he lives them out very humanly and in a way that isn't so out there that it becomes impossible for us to relate to. Like one of the ways that he is constantly living out in a very human way that virtue of fortitude is by constantly challenging the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes of the law, right? This was a big no-no. This is not what you did, especially as a faithful Jew, because these were the people who kept the law. These were the people who knew the law, and these were the people who were going to help you make sure that you were living in accordance with the law. And so challenging that group of people would have taken a lot of strength. It would have taken a lot of courage because, again, for several thousand years, it's been this group of people passing everything down. And so Jesus stepping into that role of being the one to challenge those authorities, right, takes a lot of fortitude. And that's something, again, that we can kind of take to ourselves, right? There are these perhaps known injustices that we see, right? And we have the choice, right? We can stand up to it or not. We can choose to challenge it or not. And so I think of all the times when Jesus challenges the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scholars as that kind of great example of fortitude. And that kind of comes to a head when he cleanses the temple, right? So if you don't remember the story, Jesus is coming to the temple and there's the money changers and the people selling the animals for sacrifice and everything. Jesus overturns their tables. He kicks them all out. Furious in the way that he says it is, you have turned my father's house into a marketplace. He's furious at them. And again, this takes strength. This takes courage because, again, this is upsetting a lot of the status quo. I think another really great way that we see Jesus living out the virtue of fortitude is that he not only challenges the Pharisees and cleanses the temple, but he goes with compassion to the poor and the sinners and the lepers, the outcasts, those who were considered unclean. And again, this takes a lot of strength, this takes a lot of courage, because this is not something you did, especially as a faithful Jew. Going into these places would make one ritually unclean and unfit then for all of the ritual worship, all of the temple sacrifices that you're supposed to be doing. And so the fact that Jesus decides to go into all these places in order to meet these people and bring them into the salvation he's offering is an incredible feat. And again, this is something that we can do. This is not something that is like so far out there that it's outside of something we can relate to, because we can go to the poor, we can go to the sinner, we can bring them into that fold as well. And so that's part of what I love about Jesus through the Gospels, is that we see these eminently practical ways that we can imitate him as he demonstrates for us how to live some of these virtues. Now, most obviously, the way Jesus lives out the virtue of fortitude is in the way of the cross. And it blows my mind every time I think about the way of the cross, because Jesus is in control of the whole situation. At no point is Jesus not the one in power, which means that he chooses to endure the scourging at the pillar, the crowning of thorns, the buffets and the spitting and the strikes from the soldiers and the jeers of the crowd. Think about this. Jesus chooses to be so weak that he falls 3 times. Right? That's a choice that Jesus makes, to be weak in those moments. And Jesus chooses in those moments to need help carrying the cross. He chooses to need Simon of Cyrene. He chooses all of these things, right? Which again, take a lot of strength, take a lot of courage. He chooses them for you, right? He chooses them for me. He chooses them for us, because this is how he wins salvation, right? And it's not that we stole his life from him, right? He chooses to lay it down freely. He chooses to go to the way of the cross. He chooses to submit his hands and feet to the nails. He chooses to submit his head to the thorns. This is a choice that he makes in order to bring about, again, our salvation and the way that we get reconciled back into the right relationship with the Father. And it's just incredible, right? And among a lot of other things, right? The cross is it's that ultimate demonstration of what it means to have and instantiate that virtue of fortitude. Now, when we see and we think about ourselves imitating Christ in the virtues, it can also be helpful to think about the saints, because again, the saints are those people who, just like you and me, and in a very similar way that Jesus chooses to go through the way of the cross, the saints are merely people who choose to imitate Jesus to a degree of perfection that becomes incredibly excellent to the point where we're certain of their stance in heaven. Now, certainly all of the saints will need fortitude. I don't know that there's a way to actually live Christianity without at least a certain amount of fortitude, but to me, one of the best examples is Saint Joan of Arc. So I don't know what you were doing as a 13-year-old, but St. Joan of Arc was having visions of St. Michael and other figures calling her as a 13-year-old to go to the King of France and help him drive out the English occupation in a military fashion. As a 13-year-old girl, I was collecting Pokemon cards. Again, I don't know what you were doing. I was not doing that. And she not only does she take it up, this calling, but she finally gets a hearing 3 years later at age 16. And it's because she convinces some of the soldiers in the French army, as well as some of the royal court, that her visions are real. So she finally gets these hearings with the king. And you'd think that that would be enough, right? As especially such a young person, finally getting this hearing with the king about driving the English occupation out of your country. The Lord then continues to ask more of her. In fact, the Lord says that you need to be at the king's side during some battles. The army will not win if you're not there, essentially. And so she starts actually dressing in military armor. And interestingly enough, she refused to carry a sword most of the time. In fact, she would rather carry this banner, the banner for Christ, which I believe she said, I prefer the banner of Christ 40 times to that of the sword because it will be that much more effective. Something to that effect. Anyways, so she's going to battle, and and the French are having these victories. And some of the French army and some of the king's officers are still unconvinced. And I kind of understand their point. Like, there's this teenage girl giving you military advice that seems very odd. So they try to test her visions. And so they send her to Orleans, where the French have experienced nothing but defeat. And she was intentionally kept ignorant of the entire enemy intel, as well as like her own French military strategies. She was intentionally kept out of all of that just to see if these visions of victory were actually real. And so Joan of Arc shows up in Orleans, again, carrying nothing but the banner, and the French start to experience victories there. The amount of fortitude, right? Courage and strength as they come together in order to accomplish any of that, to me, is incredible, right? And it's this beautiful way of imitating the Lord in his living out of fortitude. And I don't know if you know the story, but eventually Joan of Arc, she's imprisoned, she's tried, and she's executed, and she's burned at the stake. And the English, I think they burned her body like 3 times. Like, they were so angry with her and so like wanting to show their dominance that they burned her ashes 2 more times, just to make sure that there was no lasting vestige of who she was for the French army, because she had become a symbol for the entire nation of victory and hope. And so what we learn not only from Jesus, but we learn from Joan of Arc, is that the first step when we want to cultivate fortitude in our own lives is it's got to start by listening to the call that God puts on our life. Right? Jesus, and he'll say this through the Gospels, Jesus' life is oriented toward the cross. It's oriented toward our salvation. And so when that call is placed on his life, of course, that's where he's going to go, so long as he has that virtue of fortitude, that strength, and that courage to carry it out, which again is a gift from the Lord. We see this also in Joan of Arc, right? Joan didn't just decide one day, I need to go talk to the king. She had this calling placed on her life, and it was a calling that she couldn't deny. It was these visions that she couldn't deny. And so the virtue of fortitude starts by listening, right? It starts by understanding what the call of God actually is on our lives. And then we take the steps we need in order to carry it out. And most of us have to kind of start small, right? Most of us aren't and thankfully, most of us aren't called to like go to directly to the king and get him to do things with his military, right? Most of us, we start in these small ways. Maybe it's reaching out to a friend or a family member, or inviting a coworker to mass, or whatever it is, right? We take these small steps of strength and courage, and then as we take them, we start to see how God responds, and that He actually gives us the fortitude that we're needing in order to take the next step. And so, again, most of us don't just kind of leap into all of this stuff, but we take the small steps that we need to, in order to actually carry out the plan that God has placed on our lives. And so, personally, I mean, not only do I love the story of Joan of Arc, but I look to now Saint Pier Giorgio Frassati. Giorgio Frassati, he's one of the newest saints in the church. What I love about Giorgio Frassati is not only is he I think a great example of fortitude, but in a very opposite way of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was very public, in her courage and in her strength, and Frassati is very, very quiet. And what I love about Frassati is that, so he came from a wealthy family, and would go out into his village, and nobody knew what he was really doing. And what it ended up coming to light was that he would just walk around his village taking care of the homeless and those who couldn't take care of themselves, and would buy them food and would buy them medicine and would provide for their needs, in a way that they couldn't. And he didn't just do this like once because it's a nice kind of thing. This was his routine. He was just constantly going out to the margins. Again, when we talked about that example from Jesus, right? Going out to the poor and the marginalized. This is where Frassati knew he could actually do that, right? He could actually go to these people and provide for their needs in a way that they couldn't. And I love Giorgio Frassati because not only does he have that fortitude in that religious sense, but he had a fortitude in a very secular sense. He was an adventurer, loved mountain climbing. And there's a very famous picture of Giorgio Frassati. He's climbing onto this mountain. He's kind of clinging to this cliff, and he himself wrote on it an Italian phrase, verso l'alto, which in Italian means to the heights. And what I love about Frassati is that he took that secular, adventurous spirit, they took that secular fortitude, that mix of courage and strength, and he let it not only take him to the heights in that physical, secular way of climbing the mountains, but he lets him take it to the heights of the religious as well, right? As he imitates our Lord, in that virtue of fortitude.
My name is Sharon Dichtel, and I'm here to share my saint story. And it starts with a day that was very difficult. And maybe you've had this experience before where it feels like somebody's giving you a hard time purposefully, and then sending texts to match with that. So that's how this experience started. And it subsequently led my family to being late, going out to a family wedding the night before. But my mom was at the Airbnb, but we wanted to spend some time with her. And we finally get there. I was all worked up, trying not to let it show. And she was sitting there reading. She was like, oh, just reading a book. And she was reading Heaven is for Real. And she said, have you ever read this before? And I said, yeah, actually. And launched into this story about how I had a big epiphany where the boy in the story, Colton Burpo, has this experience of heaven. And he said, the part that haunted me was that he said he saw his dad fighting in the battle of good and evil. And then I went, no, you know what this is? It's a fight in the battle of good and evil. So I went, St. Michael, okay, what's that prayer? And the only part of the prayer that I could remember was, St. Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, defend us from, or protect us from the wickedness and snares of the devil. I mean, whatever part I remembered, it was only the beginning. And I just began saying that like a mantra. And as I said that over and over, I could feel myself calming down. and realizing, oh, I didn't have to rely on my own strength, that it's God helping me and his helpers helping me. So this was a huge experience. And when I would find myself getting worked up, I would start saying that prayer again. I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. So I asked God, can you send me something? Will you give me something as like a memento, like a holy souvenir for this event so that I can look at that and remember this story so I don't forget? And however long it takes you, God, I know I'll recognize it when you send it. And so I kept praying that and praying the prayer and getting through the day. Well, my mom was going through this box of things, and she was, oh, do you want something in here? I took it from Grandpa's house. We were clearing it out, and she's pulling out these things that I remember from our childhood. And I was waiting for like a St. Michael statue to pop up or something. And I said, eventually, do you have one of those? And she's like, no, I have St. Anne, but that's for somebody else. So I'm like, that's okay. So she's going through, and she finds this like skewer set, and she's going through it, and she's trying to find, and I was like, oh, I want that. So she's trying to find all the pieces, and I said, did you want to keep that? And she said, no, did you want it? I said, yes. And I took it from her. And I'm like, okay, God, when you send that thing, I'll know what it is. And so when I was praying that prayer, I pictured St. Michael in my mind's eye, standing there with a sword over his head. And I went, oh my gosh, God, you gave me the sign or the souvenir, the holy souvenir, and I hadn't even realized it. It was the skewer set that my mom was putting back together. And all the skewers are little swords. Whoops. And then it was another thing I realized then too. I don't think it was my big fat idea to have this holy souvenir. I think God was saying, I'm going to send you something so you remember this, so that it's a physical memento of this epiphany. And I just kind of caught onto that and said, oh, God, will you send me something? He's like, yeah, sure, Sharon. You can think it's your idea. But yeah, so I have my skewer set, my holy souvenir of the battle that St. Michael helps us to fight, helps give us the strength when only we call on him.
So again, what we see in the virtue of fortitude is that whether it's through the example of Christ or through the example of St. Joan of Arc, or even here through the example of Pier Giorgio Frassati, fortitude starts with listening. It starts with understanding who you are in relationship to God and what his call is actually on your life. And from that point, right, taking those small steps of that mix of strength and courage, right, to actually carry out that plan and become the disciple that he asks you to be.